Martha Johnson had been through worse in her 72 years. Segregation, poverty, loss. But somehow, this moment stings the most. She was shopping at a grocery store in Willow Creek, her hands shaking, counts her last few dollars at the checkout, praying she has enough for the diapers she desperately needs. But before she can finish, a smug young cop steps forward, his voice dripping with cruelty. "Diapers? At your age? Blackie?" Huh. Laughter ripples through the store and the crowd looks away. Silent, complicit. But someone is watching. A towering figure in the lane, fists clenched, heart pounding. Shaquille O'Neal. He had come to town in peace, but what he just witnessed? That changes everything. Because this isn't just about an old woman or a rude cop. It's about justice, dignity, and a town drowning in its own dark past. And Shaq isn't leaving until the whole world sees the truth. Before continuing this amazing story, let us know where you're watching from. If you like this story, make sure to subscribe. Let's begin our story. The automatic doors of Willow Creek Grocery slid open with a soft whoosh, letting in the warm afternoon air. Inside, the store buzzed with quiet activity. Shoppers pushing carts, cashiers scanning items, and soft country music playing over the speakers. The scent of fresh bread and ground coffee filled the air, mixing with the faint smell of disinfectant. Martha Johnson stepped inside, adjusting her light blue cardigan over her thin shoulders. At 72, her petite frame had grown frail, but there was still strength in the way she carried herself. Her back straight, her chin slightly lifted. Her silver-gray hair was neatly pinned into a bun, and a pair of reading glasses rested on the bridge of her nose. She pushed her small shopping cart slowly, pausing every now and then to check the prices on the shelves. Her wrinkled fingers trembled slightly as she reached into her purse and pulled out a folded grocery list, handwritten in careful cursive. Diapers. Size 4. Milk bread. Peanut butter. That was all she could afford this week. She turned into the baby care aisle, her eyes scanning the shelves. Her great-grandson Jamal was only 4 years old, but he still needed diapers at night. He had been struggling with potty training, and Martha didn't want him to feel embarrassed. She found the right size and picked up a pack, holding it close as she shuffled toward the checkout lanes. Across the store, Officer Brad Thompson strolled through the aisles in his police uniform, his badge gleaming under the fluorescent lights. He walked with a cocky swagger, his piercing blue eyes scanning the crowd as if looking for trouble. He wasn't on official business, just grabbing a few things on his break, but he enjoyed the way people moved out of his way, nodding politely as he passed. Brad noticed Martha in the checkout line, holding the pack of diapers against her chest. Something about the sight made him smirk. An old black woman buying diapers? He didn't think much of people like her, poor, struggling, always needing help from the government. His father, the former police chief, had raised him to believe that people like Martha were the reason Willow Creek had problems. He decided to have some fun. Martha placed the diapers on the conveyor belt, then reached into her purse to count her money. The cashier, a young woman with blonde hair and tired eyes, barely looked at her as she scanned the item. "That'll be $17.49, the cashier said, popping her gum. Martha's fingers fumbled with the bills. She had exactly $18, but she had hoped to have a little change left over. With slow, careful movements, she handed over the money. That's when Brad stepped up beside her. "Well, well," he said loudly, making sure people nearby could hear talk. "Didn't think I'd see the day. An old lady buying diapers. That for you, Grandma?" A couple of shoppers glanced over. Martha stiffened, feeling her face grow hot. "They're for my great-grandson," she said softly, not looking at him. Brad chuckled, crossing his arms. "Sure they are. You got ID for those, ma'am? Hate to say it, but folks your age don't usually need baby supplies." The cashier let out a short laugh, quickly covering her mouth. Martha's hands shook as she took her receipt. Brad wasn't done. "You sure you paid for those, ma'am?" he said, his voice dripping with fake politeness. "Not trying to pull a fast one, are you?" A few more customers stopped what they were doing to watch. Martha swallowed hard. "I paid," she said quietly. Brad shook his head, grinning. "Just checking. Gotta keep an eye on things around here, you know. Some people get ideas." At the end of the aisle, near the snack section, a tall man in a black hoodie and sweatpants stood motionless, his large hands clenched into fists. Shaquille O'Neal had been watching the whole time. Shaq wasn't in Willow Creek for attention. He'd come to visit an old friend, Reverend Elijah Green, and planned to keep a low profile. He had pulled his baseball cap low to avoid recognition, but when he saw the scene unfolding, he couldn't stay quiet. He stepped forward, his towering 7 feet 1 inch frame casting a long shadow. The moment Brad noticed him, his confident smirk wavered. Shaq took off his cap, revealing his unmistakable face. Gasps rippled through the store. "Excuse me," Shaq said, his deep voice calm but firm. "Is there a problem here?" Brad swallowed, suddenly aware that all eyes were now on him. "No problem," he muttered, shifting uncomfortably. "Just doing my job." Shaq folded his arms. "Your job is to harass old ladies buying diapers?" Brad opened his mouth, then closed it again. He glanced at the customers, who were now whispering among themselves. Shaq turned to Martha and gave her a warm smile. "Ma'am, let me carry those for you." Martha hesitated, then nodded. "Thank you, son." Shaq took the pack of diapers and placed a gentle hand on her back, guiding her toward the exit. As they walked away, he didn't look back at Brad, but he didn't need to. The tension in the air was thick enough to cut. As Shaq and Martha stepped outside, the warm breeze hit their faces. She sighed, gripping her purse tightly. "I don't want no trouble," she said softly. Shaq looked down at her, his expression serious. "That man was out of line. And trust me, this ain't over." Martha glanced up at him, searching his face. She had seen men like Brad before, men who thought they could treat people like her any way they pleased. She had spent her whole life enduring moments like this, but this time was different, because this time, Shaquille O'Neal was watching. The sun hung low in the sky as Shaquille O'Neal walked beside Martha Johnson, carrying the pack of diapers with ease. His large hands gripped the plastic tightly, but his mind was still replaying what had just happened inside the store. He had seen many things in his life: poverty, injustice, unfair treatment. But something about watching an elderly woman like Martha get humiliated by a man in uniform struck a nerve deep inside him. Martha, on the other hand, walked with the quiet dignity of someone who had been through worse. She didn't complain, didn't demand justice. She just wanted to go home. "You okay, ma'am?" Shaq asked gently as they reached the sidewalk. Martha nodded, though her eyes held the weight of something deeper. "I'm fine, son. I've dealt with men like that my whole life. Ain't nothing new." Shaq exhaled, shaking his head. "That don't make it right." Martha glanced up at him, a small smile tugging at the corners of her lips. "No, it don't. But it's the world we live in." Shaq wasn't satisfied with that answer. Not this time. Back inside Willow Creek Grocery, Officer Brad Thompson stood frozen in place. The laughter that had been in his voice minutes earlier had vanished. Instead, he was left with the unmistakable feeling that he had just messed up, badly. A few shoppers were still looking at him, whispering. Some shook their heads in disapproval. Even the cashier, who had left along with him earlier, now looked uncomfortable. Brad clenched his jaw, forcing himself to stand tall. It was just an old lady. It was just a joke. But that wasn't how the others saw it. Man, that was Shaquille O'Neal, one customer muttered. "You just embarrassed yourself in front of a legend." Another shopper snorted. "Not just a legend. A man who doesn't let stuff like this slide." Brad ignored them and stormed toward the exit. The last thing he needed was to be lectured by a bunch of nobodies. But deep down, a seed of doubt had been planted. Shaq walked Martha to a small, worn-down house a few blocks away from the grocery store. The neighborhood was quiet, but there were signs of struggle everywhere. Peeling paint, overgrown yards, and broken-down cars sitting lifeless in driveways. "This is me," Martha said as they approached her porch. "You ain't got to walk me all the way, son." Shaq smiled. "I wanted to." Martha pulled her keys from her purse and unlocked the front door. As they stepped inside, Shaq's eyes took in the small but tidy living room. A faded floral couch sat in the corner, a crocheted blanket draped over the armrest. Framed pictures lined the wall, some black and white, others newer. In each one, Martha's family smiled back at him. And in the middle of it all, playing on the carpet with a plastic toy truck, was Jamal. The little boy looked up, his wide brown eyes locking onto Shaq's towering frame. "Whoa," Jamal whispered, his tiny fingers clutching his truck. "You're big." Shaq let out a deep chuckle. "And you're small." Jamal grinned. "Are you a superhero?" Shaq knelt down, setting the pack of diapers on the floor. "What do you think?" Jamal studied him seriously. "Yeah, but you don't got a cape." Martha laughed softly, shaking her head. "Lord, this boy." Shaq ruffled Jamal's curls, feeling a warmth spread through his chest. He turned back to Martha. "How you been holding up, ma'am?" Martha sighed, lowering herself onto the couch. "I manage. Been raising this boy since he was a baby. His mama, she's got troubles. I pray for her, but..." She shook her head. "Jamal's my heart, though. I do what I gotta do." Shaq nodded, feeling a deep respect for this woman. He had met strong people in his life, coaches, teammates, mentors, but there was a different kind of strength in Martha. The quiet kind, the kind that didn't ask for recognition. And yet, people like Brad Thompson thought they could treat her like she was nothing. "I ain't letting this go," Shaq said suddenly. Martha looked up. "Letting what go?" "That cop, what he did back there, that ain't just some joke. It's a symptom of something bigger, and I can't stand by and let it slide." Martha's expression softened. "Shaq, honey, I appreciate you looking out for me. But what can you really do?" Shaq stood, his massive form nearly filling the room. "A lot." An hour later, Shaq found himself knocking on the door of Reverend Elijah Green, the man who had been like a second father to him during his teenage years. The door opened, revealing a tall, slender man with salt and pepper hair and deep, thoughtful eyes. "Well, look who the Lord brought back to Willow Creek," Reverend Green said, a slow smile spreading across his face. "Come in, son." Shaq stepped inside, greeted by the familiar scent of old books and brewing coffee. "What's on your mind?" the Reverend asked, settling into his chair. Shaq leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees. "I saw something today. A cop, Brad Thompson, humiliating an old woman in the grocery store. Made her feel small, and I can't let it slide." Reverend Green exhaled, rubbing his chin. "Brad Thompson? That name ain't new to me." Shaq frowned. "What do you mean?" The Reverend leaned back, his expression grim. "Brad's father was the police chief before him, and let's just say the apple didn't fall far from the tree." Shaq's jaw tightened. "So this ain't the first time?" Reverend Green shook his head. "No, son, it ain't." Shaq sat back, the weight of the town's history pressing down on him. He had come here thinking he'd be dealing with one man's bad behavior, but it was deeper than that. "So what do we do?" Shaq asked. Reverend Green smiled knowingly. "We do what we've always done. We stand up, loud enough that they have to listen." Shaq nodded slowly. "Then let's get loud." The next morning, Shaq walked straight into the Willow Creek Police Department. Heads turned. Officers stopped mid-conversation. The secretary at the front desk blinked up at him, her mouth slightly open. "I need to see Officer Brad Thompson," Shaq said. The woman hesitated. Do you have an appointment?" Shaq raised an eyebrow. "I think he'll want to see me." Within minutes, Brad appeared, his uniform crisp, his face pale. He wasn't expecting this. "What do you want?" Brad asked, folding his arms. Shaq stepped closer, towering over him. "I want you to understand what you did yesterday," Brad scoffed. "Look, man." "Don't look, man, me," Shaq interrupted, his voice calm but firm. "You disrespected a woman who's lived through more than you could imagine. You embarrassed her, and you did it in uniform. That ain't right." Brad's jaw tightened. "I was just joking." "Was she laughing?" Shaq shot back. Silence. Shaq took a step back. "I ain't here to fight you. I'm here to tell you that Willow Creek is watching, and if you think you can keep getting away with treating people like that, you're wrong." Brad swallowed hard, but said nothing. Shaq turned to leave. "You want to be a real officer? Then start acting like one." As he walked out, he could feel the eyes of the department on him. The battle wasn't over, but it had begun. The air in Willow Creek felt different the morning after Shaq's visit to the police station. The news had spread fast, faster than Brad Thompson would have liked. People whispered about it in coffee shops, at barbershops, and on front porches. Shaquille O'Neal had called out the police. Some folks were cheering. Others were waiting to see what would happen next. And then there were people like Brad's father, Walter Thompson, who sat in his spacious office at City Hall, scowling as he read an email from the police chief. Walter, a tall man in his 60s, with a sharp jawline and silver hair, had ruled Willow Creek in one way or another for decades. First as a police chief, now as a city councilman. He believed in law and order, his version of it. And now, Shaq was messing with it. He picked up the phone and dialed a number. "Chief Morrison," he said when the man on the other end answered. "I want to know exactly what O'Neal said to my son." Brad sat in his patrol car, gripping the steering wheel so hard his knuckles turned white. Yesterday had shaken him, not because of guilt, at least that's what he told himself, but because of how fast things had escalated. He had spent his whole life being told he was better than those people. He had grown up believing his uniform gave him power, that he was untouchable, but Shaq had made him feel small, and he hated it. His radio crackled. "Thompson, report to the station." He sighed, ran a hand through his blonde hair, and turned on the ignition. Across town, Sarah Mitchell, a reporter for the Willow Creek Gazette, tapped her fingers against her desk. She had seen the incident at the grocery store. She had seen Shaq step in. And she had seen the way Brad had walked away, humiliated. Her journalist instincts told her this was bigger than one bad cop mocking an old woman. Sarah had been in Willow Creek long enough to know that racism wasn't a new story here. But what intrigued her was why Shaq cared so much. She opened her laptop and started digging. First, she looked up Walter Thompson, Brad's father. His name was all over old police reports. And not just as an officer, but as someone connected to cover-ups. Then she searched for Martha Johnson. And what she found made her heart stop. Sarah grabbed her phone and dialed a number. "Reverend Green?" she said when he answered. "We need to talk." Reverend Elijah Green sat across from Sarah in his church office. The walls were lined with books, some Bibles, some history books, some old legal documents. Sarah had shown him what she found, an article from 40 years ago about a black man named Earl Johnson, Martha's late husband. Reverend Green sighed. "I remember Earl." "What happened to him?" Sarah asked. The Reverend's eyes darkened. "He was murdered." Sarah leaned forward. And, Reverend Green said carefully, Walter Thompson was the police chief at the time. Sarah's pulse quickened. "Was Brad's father involved?" The Reverend nodded slowly. "We always suspected it. Earl was a good man, worked hard, had a wife and kids. One night, he got into an argument with some white men at a bar. Next morning, he was found dead near the train tracks. Police called it an accident." Sarah felt sick. "And no one did anything?" "People were scared," Reverend Green said. "Walter Thompson had the whole department in his pocket." Sarah's mind raced. This wasn't just about Brad. This was generational. She stood up. "I need to talk to Martha." Martha Johnson sat in her small living room watching Jamal build a tower out of plastic blocks. When Sarah knocked on the door, Martha wasn't surprised. She knew this day would come. Sarah sat down across from her, notebook in hand. "I know about Earl," she said gently. Martha's hands trembled slightly as she set down her teacup. "That was a long time ago, child." "But it still matters," Sarah pressed. "Shaq stood up for you yesterday. But I think this is bigger than just what happened in that grocery store. I think this town has been covering up the truth for too long." Martha exhaled. "I never stopped fighting for Earl. I just got tired of people not listening." Sarah leaned forward. "They'll listen now." Martha looked over at Jamal, who was playing happily, unaware of the storm brewing outside. "All right," she said softly. "I'll tell my story." That evening, Shaq sat in Reverend Green's office, listening as the Reverend and Sarah laid everything out for him. Martha's story, Earl's murder, the corruption in the police force. Shaq listened in silence, his massive hands folded together. "I knew this town had problems," he finally said. "But I didn't know it went this deep." Sarah leaned forward. "Shaq, you have the power to bring national attention to this. People listen to you. If you speak out, they won't be able to ignore it." Shaq thought about Martha, about Jamal, about the generations of people in Willow Creek who had suffered in silence. Then he nodded. "Let's make some noise." The next morning, Shaq posted a video online. He told the world what he had seen in Willow Creek, the way Officer Brad Thompson had mocked an elderly black woman, the way this town had a history of looking the other way. He didn't yell. He didn't threaten. He just told the truth. And the truth spread like wildfire. Within hours, thousands of people had shared the video. National news outlets picked it up. People began demanding answers. The police department released a weak statement, calling it a misunderstanding. Shaq wasn't having it. He called for a community meeting at Reverend Green's church, a chance for people to finally speak up. And everyone knew Brad Thompson and his father would have no choice but to show up. As the sun set over Willow Creek, Martha sat on her porch, watching Jamal chase fireflies. She had spent her whole life fighting battles she never thought she could win. But this time, with Shaq on her side, with Reverend Green, with Sarah, with an entire town finally paying attention, maybe, just maybe, this time would be different. The day of the community meeting arrived. Word had spread across Willow Creek. Everyone knew what this was really about. Not just one cop mocking an elderly black woman, but decades of injustice buried under silence. At the center of it all was Shaquille O'Neal, a man too big to be ignored. He wasn't just a basketball legend anymore. He had become something bigger in this town, a voice too powerful to be dismissed. Martha Johnson, sitting in the front row of Reverend Green's church, felt a strange mix of fear and hope. She had never expected her late husband's story to come back to the surface after all these years. Beside her, Sarah Mitchell, the journalist, flipped through her notes. She had been receiving anonymous tips all day, people whispering about things they had seen, things they had been afraid to speak on. Somewhere in the back of the room, Officer Brad Thompson sat stiffly, his jaw clenched. His father, Walter Thompson, was beside him, his face unreadable. And at the front of the church, standing behind the wooden pulpit, Shaq took a deep breath and began to speak. Shaq's deep voice filled the church. "I came to Willow Creek for a quiet visit," he said. "I didn't plan on getting involved in anything. But when I saw what happened to Ms. Martha Johnson, I couldn't stay quiet." He turned to Martha and gave her a small nod. She held her head high. What happened in that grocery store wasn't just about one officer and one woman, Shaq continued. It was about a town that has ignored the truth for too long. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Some nodded. Others shifted uncomfortably. Shaq's eyes scanned the room, then locked onto Brad. "Officer Thompson," he said, "do you remember what you said to Ms. Martha that day?" Brad's jaw tightened. He didn't answer. Shaq nodded. "You mocked her. You humiliated her. And for what? Because you assumed things about her? Because you thought nobody would stand up to you?" Brad looked at his father, but Walter didn't move. Shaq's voice hardened. "I've seen a lot in my life. I've met all kinds of people. And I know that power can do two things. It can either make you stronger, or it can make you weak. And right now, Officer Thompson, you look weak." A hush fell over the room. Brad's face burned with shame. He had never been spoken to like this, not by someone he couldn't intimidate. Shaq exhaled, his expression softening. But weakness doesn't have to be permanent. The real question is, what are you going to do about it? Brad swallowed hard. He didn't know. Before Brad could respond, Sarah stood up. She held a stack of papers in her hands. "I've been doing some research," she said, "about a man named Earl Johnson." Martha sucked in a breath. Sarah's voice was steady. "Earl Johnson was murdered in Willow Creek 40 years ago, and the police department covered it up." Gasps filled the room. Walter Thompson's expression darkened. "That's enough," he snapped. "No, it's not," Sarah shot back. She turned to the crowd. Earl was killed after an argument with white men at a bar. His death was ruled an accident, but everyone in this town knows that wasn't true. Martha's hands trembled. She had waited decades for someone to say those words out loud. Sarah's gaze landed on Walter. "And you were the police chief back then, weren't you?" Walter's lips thinned. "I won't dignify this nonsense." Sarah took a step closer. "Then tell me, why was there no investigation? Why were the men involved never charged? Why did people in the black community say they were threatened into staying quiet?" Walter's silence spoke volumes. The room was electric now, people whispering, anger simmering beneath the surface. Then a voice spoke up. "I was there that night." All eyes turned to an elderly black man sitting near the back. His name was Thomas Carter, a man who had lived in Willow Creek his whole life. "I saw them take Earl outside that night," Thomas said, his voice rough with age. "He was still breathing when they dragged him out back. But when I asked the police what happened, they told me to shut my mouth." People in the crowd gasped. Walter's face turned pale. Shaq stepped closer. His towering frame cast a long shadow. "You still want to call this nonsense?" he asked Walter. Walter clenched his fists. "This town doesn't need some washed-up basketball player stirring up trouble." Shaq's eyes never wavered. This town needs justice. Martha, who had been silent all this time, slowly stood up. She looked directly at Walter. "You stole my husband's life," she said, her voice strong. "But you won't steal my dignity." Walter opened his mouth, but Martha cut him off. "You think time makes a crime disappear?" she asked. "It doesn't. And I think it's time we stop letting people like you decide what gets forgotten." The room erupted in voices. People were no longer whispering. They were demanding answers. Walter Thompson stood up and stormed out. Brad sat frozen in his seat. His father had never run from anything. But now, in front of the whole town, he had run. Shaq turned to him. "You have a choice," he said. "You can keep being your father's son, or you can be your own man." Brad felt a lump in his throat. For the first time in his life, he realized he didn't have to be like Walter. He swallowed hard and stood up. He turned to Martha. His voice was raw. "I'm sorry." The church fell silent. Brad's hands shook. "I was wrong. I see that now. And I know an apology doesn't fix everything, but..." He exhaled. "I want to be better." Martha studied him for a long moment. Then she nodded. "Then prove it." The next few weeks in Willow Creek were unlike anything the town had seen before. Walter Thompson, once untouchable, was being investigated for past misconduct. Sarah's article about Earl Johnson's murder had gone viral. The state reopened the case. Brad resigned from the police force and started working at Reverend Green's community center, mentoring kids, trying to make up for his past. And as for Shaq? One evening, he sat with Martha on her porch, watching Jamal chase fireflies. "You did something big here," Martha said. Shaq smiled. "We did something big." Martha chuckled. "You're leaving soon, aren't you?" Shaq sighed. "Yeah, but I'll be back." She nodded. "I'll hold you to that." They sat in comfortable silence. In the distance, the town of Willow Creek felt different. For the first time in a long time, there was hope. Willow Creek had been shaken to its core. The revelations about Earl Johnson's murder and Walter Thompson's cover-up had spread like wildfire. For the first time in decades, people were openly talking about the past. No more whispers, no more silence. Walter, once the most powerful man in town, had disappeared from public life. Some said he'd fled to a family cabin out in the woods. Others believed he was waiting for the dust to settle. But the dust wasn't settling. State investigators had arrived, reopening Earl Johnson's case. Sarah Mitchell's article had gained national attention, and civil rights lawyers were now involved. Martha Johnson, once a quiet old woman minding her business, had become a symbol of resilience. People stopped her in the street, thanking her for speaking up. And, at the center of it all, was Shaquille O'Neal. Shaq had promised he wouldn't just walk away, and he kept his promise. Brad Thompson had been humbled. He had spent the last few weeks volunteering at Reverend Green's community center. At first, people didn't trust him. Some refused to speak to him. Others gave him cold, hard stares. He understood why. He had been part of the problem for too long. One afternoon, he was repainting the walls in the community gym when he felt a tiny tug on his shirt. He turned and saw Jamal Johnson, Martha's great-grandson. The 4-year-old looked up at him with big, curious eyes. "You used to be mean," Jamal said. Brad sighed, setting down the paintbrush. "Yeah, I was." Jamal thought for a second. "But now you're nice?" Brad hesitated. "I'm trying to be." Jamal smiled. "Okay." Then he ran off to play with his friends. Brad let out a slow breath. Maybe, just maybe, he still had a chance to make things right. Shaq had been quietly working behind the scenes. He didn't just want to shake things up. He wanted to create real change. One evening, he showed up at Martha's house. a thick envelope in his hands. "What's this?" Martha asked, raising an eyebrow. Shaq grinned. "Open it." She carefully peeled it open, pulling out a set of legal documents. Her eyes widened. "Shaquille, what is this?" Shaq leaned forward. "I bought you a house." Martha's hand flew to her chest. "What?" "A brand new house outside of town. Big backyard for Jamal. Safe neighborhood. Everything paid for. No more struggling to make ends meet." Tears welled up in her eyes. "Shaq, I can't accept this." "Yes, you can," Shaq smiled. "You took care of your family for years. Now let somebody take care of you." Martha wiped her eyes. "I don't know what to say," Shaq chuckled. "Say yes. And pack your bags." She looked at the papers again, then at Shaq. Finally, she nodded. Yes. Walter Thompson had spent his life untouchable. But now, the law was closing in. Investigators had found new evidence in Earl Johnson's case, documents that had been buried deep in police records. There were whispers that Walter had paid off witnesses back in the day. Now, he was facing real consequences. One night, Brad stood outside his father's house, staring at the man who had raised him. Walter sat on the porch, a glass of whiskey in his hand, his face hard and bitter. "You think you're better than me now?" Walter sneered. Brad shook his head. "I think I'm trying to be better." Walter scoffed. "You're a disgrace." Brad clenched his jaw. "No, Dad, you are." He turned and walked away. For the first time in his life, he wasn't afraid of his father. The town of Willow Creek was changing. Reverend Green's church was packed every Sunday. The community center had received new funding, thanks to a generous donation from Shaq. And for the first time in years, black and white residents were working together, demanding justice, demanding a better future. At the heart of it all was Martha Johnson. She wasn't just the old lady at the grocery store anymore. She was a warrior, a survivor, a woman whose story had shaken a town awake. One evening, she sat on the porch of her new home, watching Jamal ride his bike in the driveway. Shaq sat beside her, sipping iced tea. "You happy?" he asked. Martha smiled. "Happier than I've been in a long time." Shaq nodded. "Good." She looked at him. "And what about you?" "Where are you going next?" Shaq sighed. "There's always another fight somewhere, another town that needs help." Martha chuckled. "You ever think about slowing down?" Shaq grinned. "Maybe one day." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the sun set over Willow Creek. A town that had once been broken was now on the path to healing. And it had all started with one moment in a grocery store. Guys, thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed this story. Let us know about your thoughts in the comment section. Also subscribe the channel for daily stories notification.